You are listening to the Pot.Live podcast. I'm your host, Lenny G, and this podcast is going to teach you all about what's happening, what the trends are, the latest news, the thought leaders, the business leaders in the cannabis industry. As this industry moves forward at a rapid pace, everyone needs to adapt. Everyone needs to change to what's going on. And we're going to bring you those guests. What are they doing to make their business successful? What are they doing to get their product out there? How are they getting exposure? How are they dealing with all the changing laws? That's what Pot.Live is going to be all about. And make sure you visit Pot.Live, download the app, go to the website, and you will see all of the digital media assets from articles, videos, podcasts, everything. The latest news and trends will all be at Pot.Live. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the show. Have you checked out the new MJ.com? That's right, a 2-letter domain in the cannabis industry, and it's the only one. It's got everything you need. You can get the latest news, articles, trends, information from business insiders, business leaders, political, medical, professional, whatever you need is right at MJ.com. You can shop on their marketplace for all the top brands, including the newly released full spectrum CBD product line from MJ.com. And don't forget the new MJ VIP membership platform, where you can have insider access behind the curtain of all the top features in the industry, discounts, free items, everything that you could only get by being a VIP member at MJ.com. Check us out. Welcome to another episode of the Pot.Live podcast. I'm your host, Lenny G, and today we have a special guest, Mr. Lewis Koski. He's the Chief Operating Officer of Metrc. Metrc is a regulatory compliance agency, and I may get this wrong, that works with governmental agencies, and Lewis is going to tell us all about it. He also just wrote a recent op-ed in Forbes called America's Cannabis Industry, Balancing Strong Regulation and Businesses' Desire for Accountability. Lewis, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So why don't you give the listeners, and we have listeners, as we go through this, we have listeners that are beginners to the industry, we have business owners, we have big business owners, we have investors. So just so you know who the listeners are, but first let's start with a little background. Who is Lewis Koski?
So I've been involved with cannabis policy for over 9 years now. I got my start when I was a executive in the state of Colorado, tasked with helping the state implement cannabis policy for the first time back in 2014. I actually started with that agency when it was first tasked with regulating marijuana businesses in 2010. And by the time 2014 rolled around, I had become the director of the Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division. And I was largely tasked with all of the monitoring and enforcement of the regulations, but I was also actively involved in the creation and the promulgation of regulations in the state of Colorado during that time. After having been with the state for about 13 years, both in the law enforcement and the regulatory side, I transitioned to the private sector, where I continued helping governments across the country and sometimes even around the world develop and implement cannabis policy, utilizing some of the best practices that I had learned along the way, starting in Colorado and out in California and Massachusetts and in a number of different areas. Earlier this year, I left that private sector consulting business and started to work for Metrc, which is one of the premier seed-to-sale companies in the country. We're currently in 13 states, and we help government both track cannabis from seed to sale, but also we help them instill some of the best practices that we've learned along the way as a company that has been doing this type of work since its original work in Colorado in 2013 and 14.
Okay, great. So let's tackle what Metrc does right off the bat. So for let's hit it from two angles, from the consumer angle and from a business that may want to work with you. So tell everybody what the pros and cons are of tracking seed to sale on the products that are out there.
Well, I think one of the primary pros of tracking cannabis using seed-to-sale tracking is it provides the regulator with a tool by which they can efficiently account for product that cannabis licensees report into the system. every state that we work in, and almost every state across the country that has adopted permissive cannabis policy, whether it's medical or adult use cannabis use, they have adopted inventory accountability standards, and a lot of times that is tracked through a seed-to-sale system. Our system allows the government to efficiently monitor and, if necessary, enforce on compliance issues based on the platform that we use for reporting. The other advantage is that the way in which we equip government to be able to efficiently monitor allows licensees to also efficiently use the system in such a way that they can report into the system and be reasonably assured that if they do everything they're supposed to in Metrc, especially when it comes to inventory controls, they can be reasonably certain that when the government shows up to do inspections, that they're going to be in compliance with many of those inventory tracking regulations. The other advantage is that we use state-of-the-art radio frequency ID technology that allows the regulator to be able to come in and do inventories in a very short period of time, because they do not have to touch each tag that's required to be put on the plants. So they don't have to scan a barcode or a QR code. The regulators can actually read the tag if they're 20 feet or less away from the actual tag, making it much easier for them to inventory thousands of plants in minutes rather than hours. You know, some of the things that we've heard about, some of the drawbacks to inventory tracking is whether or not the systems that companies already use, like point of sale systems or ERP systems, there's always concerns about whether or not those are going to integrate well with their operationalized systems. And Metrc is capable actually of, we have an API that allows those systems to be able to seamlessly work with Metrc and communicate back and forth, trading data to Metrc and from Metrc to help service their customer base. And I think last time I checked, there was several hundred different companies that have integrated into that API that utilize Metrc.
Now, I'll play devil's advocate here for a second. Is there an ability for a business owner to be able to manipulate the tracking system?
I would say that any technology system that exists out there, there's always the potential for there to be some form of manipulation. What we've done over time, and this has certainly evolved over the last few years, is the way data is put into the system. It allows regulators to be able to understand both the granular data that has been reported into the system by the licensee, but it also gives them a industry-wide perspective as well. And from that industry-wide perspective, they're able to understand many of the trends. For example, they know the average amount of product that is yielded from 10 plants or 20 plants. If licensees are under-reporting or over-reporting into the system in any way, they become an outlier. And those outliers are apparent to the regulators, and regulators can inquire further to better understand why a licensee might be so far out of scope from other licensees with similar functionality.
Now, for the beginners out there that are listening to us, we discussed this a lot on the show. And basically, you know, obviously legalization is going to happen nationally, federally at some point, whether it's medically first, recreational, or both at some point. Probably will be a big election topic next year. But can you explain for the beginners how a seed-to-sale system like Metrc helps governmental agencies, you know, accelerate towards legalization so they can actually trust the process, trust the licensed companies, as opposed to all that black market stigma that's out there?
Well, I think, so first thing I would say is that Metrc helps both the government side of the equation, but also the business side of the equation. So it helps government in that it provides them with a technology platform in which they can do their work efficiently. In the absence of having a technology resource that holds all of the inventory data, regulators are compelled to do their work the old-fashioned way by looking at paperwork, scanning barcodes, and those types of things, which are very time-consuming. And that time-consuming and labor-intensive process also has a really negative impact on the licensed community in that they're essentially unable to operate fully while the regulators are in licensed premises doing all that work. So that's one thing. The other thing that you would be concerned about then is well, what is the cost of having such a robust system to the industry? And our system is designed in such a way that even the smallest of businesses have a scaled cost for use of the system. So the system is based off of a small monthly fee that gives them unlimited support, unlimited training, and a tremendous amount of resources to be able to report into the system. And the system is also built largely based off of everything that we've learned from the industry. We have a dedicated group that is focused on support and training, and they hear all of the questions and all of the concerns that come from industry that are well beyond just the scope of seed to sale. And so we have a very strong, in-depth understanding of what the challenges are that the industry faces, so that we're able to craft our support, our training, and the functionality of the system such that whether you're a small business or a really large business, you're going to have the resources and help that you need to be very successful reporting into the system and demonstrating compliance to the regulator at a very affordable cost.
Thank you for that. And let's go back to your law enforcement background. Was that in Colorado as well?
Yes, exclusively.
Okay, exclusively in Colorado. And then your private sector work, obviously. When Colorado went legal, let's use that as a case study because it's such a hot button topic of, when a state goes legal, whether medically or rec, is the black market, is it diminished? Is it still a huge option for a certain segment? How about crime? What were your experiences once it went legal in Colorado? Did the crime change? Did the amount of DUIs, if you will, change? Did anything change that you noticed?
Yeah, things actually started to change almost immediately. Before we had the right systems in place, there was a lot of question about what product was legal and being produced through the then on-ramping regulatory market, and what product was just exclusively being grown in the criminal marketplace. And even though I think it's fair to say that those actors that decide to come into the regulatory framework and to be transparent to regulators, they operate a bit of a competitive disadvantage to begin with. What happens though is you get them up and operational and in compliance with the standards, it really starts to shine a bright light on the criminal marketplace. And what we saw, and some of this is somewhat anecdotal, but what we saw is that those criminal market actors either started to change their business model towards one of compliance, or they changed their business model altogether and looked to see who might be their other customers. So there's a lot of talk in Colorado at the time about the potential of illegal cannabis leaving the state of Colorado and going to other states. So the bottom line, though, is even though you don't see an immediate and significant change to the criminal market, you do start to see in very short order how it's impacted. And over time, through changes and adaptations to public policy, to better monitoring and enforcement, you're able to really add some clarity to the law enforcement community so that they have some understanding of when they come across product, whether or not that product is from the regulated marketplace or whether it's from the criminal market. And just by way of example, our system has system-generated manifests. So product that is within the regulated market is in what we call a closed-loop system. And it's a comprehensive set of regulations that include labeling requirements, packaging requirements, testing requirements, product accountability, and transportation requirements. And all of that adds up to create an environment where it's a lot easier to identify product that's out of the regulated market versus out of the criminal market. So with a manifest that's created in our system and product leaves one regulated licensed premises and it's on its way to another licensed premises, all of that is documented and law enforcement is able to see a manifest that comes from our system and be able to verify whether or not the product is legitimately from the regulated market or potentially from a less than legitimate source.
And would you agree that a lot of our research, at least, with some guests we've had on the show or opinions, at least, I don't know if it's research, seems that the younger generation is still going to their local dealer, and the older generation is going to more of the legit medical dispensaries or licensed dispensaries. Is that something that you saw?
I think it would be very difficult to generalize that, because I would look at that differently in the state of Colorado now than I would a state that is maybe in the early phases of implementing a robust medical or adult use program. I think that there's certainly some time that has to pass before everyone starts to, before you start seeing some significant changes in buying patterns. What we think we saw in Colorado as the market began to mature is that artisan mindset that existed, for as long as I can remember in the cannabis industry, started to develop an appreciation for all of the standards that were implemented into the regulated framework. And then as a result of that, they were able to look at packaging that had robust labeling requirements and provided useful information. They knew that the product had gone through rigorous testing to ensure that the product was safe for consumption. And those are all things that I think are very, very important to consumers. And I think it's important to government as well. You look no further than the current situation that we have with vaping, where there are a number of negative stories coming out about deaths and sickness and illness. And in the lack of regulatory structure, it's really hard to tell where the problem lies. Does the problem lie just with bad actors who are not being careful about consumers and the product that they provide to consumers? And so it's really difficult to determine that. In the legitimate legalized cannabis markets that have robust systems in it for monitoring inventory, we think those buying patterns have changed because that type of health and safety regulation is something that means something to the consumer, and they'd rather buy that than buying something that's in a Ziploc baggie that has a piece of masking tape on it that says it's Purple Kush.
So as federal legalization happens, I want to get your opinion on what do you think the time frame is for medical, recreational, or both being federally legal? And then the second part of that, what does that do for all the business owners? Is it better to have one federal law about how cannabis is regulated, or do you still believe that state by state need to have their own regulations?
Well, so I'll answer the first part of that question in that some form of federal legalization is not likely to occur during this current Congress. I think there's so much going on with the presidential election and politics in general that it's just likely not to get a lot of traction in the very near future. I do think it has some potential into the next presidential cycle, though, regardless of who's president. So stay tuned for that. That's about as far as I know how to prognosticate on that particular issue. And when it comes to the structure of that policy, I know firsthand that states have invested a tremendous amount of money and resources into their legalized frameworks. I also know that those legalized frameworks are nuanced from state to state. We work in 13 different states, and I've worked in a number of other countries and even more states than that. And one thing that I recognize is that the political mindset, the actual circumstances on the ground warrant states having the ability to take different approaches to cannabis legalization, and that could potentially range from anything from an all-out ban to a robust medical and adult use marketplace that's regulated comprehensively. So I think some of the better federal policy may incorporate those unique needs that states are going to have. They're going to be respectful of all the time and resources that have gone into setting up these regulated markets. And they might do something similar to what we've seen with the Cole memo, where they put out a set of best practices or standards or lines that should not be crossed when formulating that on a state-to-state basis, and then they let states do what they want to do. The one area that I might think a little differently on that, and that is on our interstate trade. where you're allowing product to move from one state to the next state. There probably needs to be and may be some more robust public policy decisions at the federal level that help to govern how that's going to be used and how that might work if regulated cannabis is leaving from a state where it's allowable, passing through a state where it's banned to arrive at another state number 3, where it's allowed. So there's some potential for the federal government to really stand up and provide some leadership on that particular issue. And of course, as a company, we stand ready to do that because we've already developed such a robust tracking program that we would be able to do that in such a way as those states that have more restrictive laws would be able to determine whether or not that product was coming from a regulated cannabis licensee.
We have a lot of listeners that are small business owners. And so I have a couple of questions on their behalf. So first, the banking situation. Obviously, we know that, even if you only own a CBD brand, it's hard to get payment processing. It's hard to get a bank account. When do you see that changing? Do you see that changing before federal legalization or anytime soon, or is it on the same timeline in your opinion?
I think there's been some progress at the federal level on the banking front. I know that there's current legislation that's working its way through the process. And I think that answer really needs to come from the federal government, and the guidance really needs to come from that. I've done some work when I was back working as a consultant, we did some work for a point of sale company that was asking the same question that you just did. And as part of that work, we interviewed some executives, both from money services firms, large money services firms, and some of the banks that are actually servicing some of the clients. And one of the things that we kept hearing from those actors, there's two things really. One is that even though the cannabis market is growing as fast as it is, it still represents a pretty small piece of what would be their overall business. And so because it was small, they're a little more reluctant to be out in front on this and risking finding themselves in trouble with federal bank regulators. So I think that was one thing that really stood out for me from that work. I think the other thing was, just because the business wasn't big enough yet, it is big enough that if it were to become less cumbersome from a federal regulatory standpoint, they're interested in it. So they're monitoring it and they're watching very closely to see how things develop. And they said even if there were to be federal legalization and that the banking issue were to be somewhat resolved and the money rails for electronic payments were to be opened up, that they probably would be making a case-by-case assessment state by state to determine whether or not those marketplaces were being regulated both robustly in the doctrine, but also in practice. And so I think the message to small businesses on this is that as you're looking to invest money into a market, you're better off looking at markets where you really think that the regulator is serious about regulating this. And then since the cost of regulation is so expensive, you should be looking to see what kind of systems that they're putting in place so that the regulators can regulate efficiently, and that as a small business, the cost of using those systems is not so cumbersome that it actually becomes a barrier to entering into that market. So I think it's a little counterintuitive for businesses to think that they want to be in a robustly and comprehensively regulated marketplace. But in this case, to get to the services that they'll ultimately need, it's probably a better place for them to land, because the credibility of the market is really important for them to be able to ultimately grow their business.
Let's fast forward a few years, once again, from the small business owner perspective, and let's say everything's federally legal, everything we just discussed, and all of a sudden Amazon's selling weed, Walmart's selling weed, Uber's delivering it. What happens to those local or regional companies, that mom and pop shop? What's an exit strategy for them? Do you think they'll just be blown out by big pharma, by all these big giant corporations which are sitting on the sidelines right now? What's your opinion on the future for the local small business owner?
Well, so I think in some ways it's at least from my perspective, it's good news in that the regulatory frameworks that are being created across the country would make it pretty challenging for those types of like the Amazon and the Walmarts just to be able to sell product on a mass scale. So I think there's some challenges that really need to be thought through. I wouldn't assume that that's going to be an easy thing for those companies to do. And just like some of the bigger banks and money services companies, they're going to want to work in a very well-regulated marketplace because their brand is at stake if something goes wrong. Those types of companies are known for doing their own self-regulatory work on everything from tobacco to computer chips. The other thing, too, that I know is that even in something that's as widely used as alcohol, there's still challenges to big companies like that actually taking over the market because interstate trade is still largely restricted. So that's part of the good news. So I wouldn't say necessarily that they're going to march in the next 12 months and take over. Now, having said that, we have seen a lot of market consolidation. There are a lot of multi-state operators that are continuing to crop up across the country, and they do so a lot of times by purchasing smaller companies so that they have a bigger footprint for their company. And they may buy a company for a couple different reasons. One, maybe it's just strategically located. Two, which is the more unfortunate one, is that it's underperforming in a heavily regulated market. Or conversely, it's doing really well, and so it's made itself a good target for one of the bigger multi-state operators. So I think there's still a place in the market for small businesses. The other thing, too, that I think is really important to understand, and this is a very, very upfront topic, especially in some of the newer the states to more recently legalized, and that is there's a lot of effort and a lot of debate that has gone into, in public discourse, that has gone into the social justice issues around legalization of cannabis. And there's been a lot of attention paid in Massachusetts and Illinois and other states where they've really focused on ensuring that those small businesses, in particular minority businesses or businesses that are coming out of the neighborhoods that were most impacted by the war on drugs, they're giving them some incentives. They're paying attention to those types of businesses, and they're trying to help them and to make sure that they have a place within the regulated community.
And before we finish up, Lewis, can you tell everyone how they can learn more about Metrc or how they can connect with the company?
So they can go to www.metrc, which is metrc.com, and they can learn more about the company, or they are welcome to email me at Lewis, Lewis, .Koski, Koski, @metrc.com.
Excellent. Okay, final question. Tell the listeners one thing that you're super excited about in the cannabis industry and one thing that concerns you.
So one of the things that I am really excited about is the reality that in many ways the legalization of cannabis has been a very positive use case, so much so that we're learning that a comprehensively regulated industry can be monitored efficiently by government and done so in a way that allows businesses within that industry to be able to thrive. So I'm really excited about that, and I'm excited about new states coming on board with the realization that good government is really possible in this area of public policy. One of the areas, of course, I'm always a little concerned about, we already talked about this, is the big players. What happens when big government gets involved on the federal side? What impact does that have on the hard work and the success that states have already had? And what happens when real big business starts to get more of a foothold in the industry? And so even though I tend to be somewhat optimistic about both of those, it's certainly something that's on my mind because there could always be unintended consequences of those market changes.
Excellent. Lewis Koski, thank you so much for being a guest. We really appreciate your time. You dropped a whole bunch of value on our listeners. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And we will see everybody next time on the Pot.live podcast. If you're listening to this podcast, that means you like digital media. And where is the home for all digital media content in the cannabis industry? It is Pot.live. That's right, Pot.live. That's where you'll find all of the podcasts that you like, just like the one you're listening to right now. All of the video content that you love, and all of the written articles, trends, news, whatever you need, it's all right there. Entertaining and educational, the home of digital media content in the cannabis industry. Visit us at Pot.live and download the free app at your Google Play Store and the Apple iTunes Store.